Edoardo Bressanelli will soon move with a new tenure position to Pisa. We are very glad about that. Before he held positions in Rome, Florence European University Institute. He's an expert in the field of party politics and also politicization of Europe, Euroscepticism, of course, and Brexit. He has recently edited a special issue of a journal, of an international journal, on Brexit, its impact on British democracy, I would say. He has, of course, published many works in the field of European politics. So thank you, Edoardo, for accepting our invitation. It's a great pleasure for us, and just leave the floor to you.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm very glad to be here. It's nice to be in Florence. London is a great place to be, but Florence is just so beautiful. And the space here, I mean the villas and the gardens, it's just incredible. Thanks so much to Professor Conti for his kind invitation and well, to the staff of New York University for making everything so smooth and simple. So without further ado, let me get on to today's topic, which is Brexit, indeed. I mean, everyone who lives in London, who lives in the UK, really, can't avoid talking and studying Brexit. If you're an academic in the country, Brexit is the topic you have to study. I wasn't studying British politics before a couple of years ago, but then, as Brexit happened, of course, my specialization on Europe had to become on Europe and Brexit. So it's what you have to do if you live in the UK in this moment. I'll take a rest as I move back to Italy. Anyway, so I'm going to talk about something quite specific today, which is Brexit and executive-legislative relations. So it's a very particular institutional angle about Brexit. It's not Brexit as such, even though I really welcome every comment. I may not be able to answer on agriculture or fisheries, if you're interested. Sorry for that. You may follow up with me. But certainly on institutions, I should be able to address the key points. So that's the illustration of what I was going to say. So you see there, that's the struggle, the constitutional crisis, someone may say. I'm going to talk about, on the one side, you see Theresa May, the British Prime Minister. So she's there and she's facing, literally in this slide, someone else she's not facing normally in life, in Parliament, in the House of Commons. Who's the other guy on the other slide? Does anyone know the other guy? He's not very famous. Bercow, yeah, so he's the Speaker of the House. So it's John Bercow, is there being the speaker, so being the arbiter of what happens in the House, because he's representing Parliament, if you like. So that's not something happening in real life. Normally, Theresa May would face Jeremy Corbyn. But here we are. So I'm talking about this challenge. I'm talking about this confrontation between the government, represented by Theresa May, and the Parliament, there represented by John Bercow. So what exactly I'm going to talk about today? So first of all, some background information on Brexit. I do assume, but please tell me if I'm getting boring, repeating information that you have already. I'm going to say something on Brexit, the key dates, the key events, before moving on to something more specific and more connected to my own research. After telling you the what, the when, and the how of Brexit very quickly, of course, I'm going to move on to the Westminster model. Still a good one for Britain, still a good one, not normatively, but still a good one in terms of describing what Britain is, how Britain functions. The executive power grab, what I argue, myself and other colleagues involved in this research, is that the executive is taking, has already taken, the opportunity of Brexit to take some powers away from Parliament, and given the Brussels is giving power back to some powers, policy powers, back to Britain, well, where do these powers go? Well, they go to the government rather than back to the Parliament. That's what we argue. I'll be more specific in a while. And then the past, the present, and the future, because of course we are talking about a process whose endpoint should be in sight, the 29th of March 2019. That's Brexit Day, so should be in sight, but at the same time, we really don't know what's going to happen. So there, I'll get a bit speculative, and I'll be talking about different scenarios, if you like, or possibilities, options that may occur from now onward. And finally, some space for QCA, but please, please, please do not do interrupt me if you want to jump in, ask questions while I'm talking. I don't see any reason really to have a talk first and then the Q&A section. So let's be flexible in that regard. First of all, I thought a sort of dictionary, if you like, some words on the Brexit lexicon may be helpful, because indeed Brexit has its own dictionary, and if you're not following up every day, you may be surprised to hear some words which, outside the Brexit bubble, or I shall rather say the British bubble in this case, may not mean really much. So that's the Brexit jargon. So what's hard Brexit? Does anyone know? What do people mean by hard Brexit? What's the hard aspect of Brexit? Please.
Going out without a deal and making it difficult, I think.
Right. So leaving the EU without any sort of agreement, going out in the wild, let's say, that's hard Brexit. Then we have soft Brexit. So what's soft in these type of Brexit? What's soft? How do we make Brexit soft? Well, let's say broadly, we do find some kind of regulatory framework which binds together the UK and the EU as you detach from the big regulatory framework, which is the one defined by the founding treaties of the European Union. You get out of the treaties, but you may find ways to soften the exit. Rather than a cliff, you may have a smooth descent. And this is a soft form of Brexit. I'll try to be a bit more, not much, but a bit more technical in a while. Then we have Article 50. Does anyone know, as you are studying EU politics, what Article 50 is? Have you ever heard about Article 50? Because that's the crux of the matter. Yes, please.
That's the article of the Maastricht. It's one of the treaties, and it outlines the 2-year period.
Yeah, absolutely.
The only article that ever mentions about a state leaving.
Yeah, exactly. It's Lisbon. It's not Maastricht. So it's the newest treaty. But you're very right on the rest. I mean, on the content of that article. It's the article defining the rules, the basic rules to get out of the European Union. The 2 years period, as you rightly said. And indeed, what we are going to do is to talk about those 2 years now, because they're coming to an end. So they started on the 29th of March 2017. We are there. We are getting there. So what happened during those 2 years? That's going to be the core content of this talk. And then another important thing here is the Irish backstop. Does anyone know what the Irish backstop is? That's what everyone is talking about now in Brussels, when people are focusing on Brexit, or certainly in Great Britain. Everyone is talking about the Irish backstop. Does anyone know what the Irish backstop is? Where it is, it's easy. It's in Ireland, no doubt. So that's clear. Does anyone know what the backstop is? Exactly. So it's about the border, and this is a backstop because has been integrated into the withdrawal agreement. It is a sort, you can think about the backstop, a sort of safety net. So if the UK gets out on the 29th of March 2018, then what the European Union and the UK will try to do is to find an agreement, a trade relationship. Now, say that they fail to agree on the terms of this new relationship, what they agreed on, certainly what the Republic of Ireland wants, and the EU then wants, is to avoid a hard border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland in the island of Ireland, which is the only land border between the UK and continental Europe. So the hard border is a big problem because in the past there have been big political troubles with terrorism in that island. So you don't want to run into troubles again. And that's the reason why that Irish backstop is so central. By the way, it is also central for some contingencies which are very important in this process. Theresa May doesn't have a majority in Parliament. She relies on a very small, tiny group of MPs, the DUP, the Northern Irish Unionists. And so this is a party from Northern Ireland, and they are the ones necessary for Theresa May to pass legislation, for instance, on the deal, on the withdrawal of the UK from the EU. So contingencies in this Brexit process are quite important. Anyway, these are some of the keywords, but they are not the only ones. There are others. I mean, these are connected not really with Brexit, but with British politics. And again, I mean, these words may not tell you anything because, I mean, to hear them every day, many times every day, you need to be there. I mean, minority government, that's political science, of course. It's a government that doesn't have enough votes in Parliament, and so has to rely on something else. In the case of Theresa May, I just said the DUP. These guys from Northern Ireland keeping the government alive. Now, these are instead the European Research Group is a group of conservative MPs, parliamentarians, of the so-called hard Brexiteers. And there are 40, 50, maybe sometimes even 70 or 80 of them, and these are a pain in the neck for Theresa May because, of course, they never content with whatever agreement is found with the European Union. So Theresa May has been losing a number of votes in Parliament, mainly, but not only, because of them. The Conservative Party is very divided. And then there, I've mentioned something which is very new. If you've been following the news these days, you would have read that a number of MPs are leaving the Labour Party and the Conservative Party and are coming together, forming this new independent group. 3 left today the Conservative Party, 1 left the Labour Party this very night, and 7 others left it yesterday. So 11 people, members of Parliament. Don't forget, the Conservatives don't have a majority there, but so 3 is an important number anyway. They are gathering together for some purpose, but the 2 key parties in Parliament and in British politics in general are losing members. They're splitting apart. Anyway, that's just as a sort of background to introduce you to the key labels of this debate. Now, the story so far. I'll be brief here, but I did want to give you some background information indeed. So what we have is, of course, in the starting moment, even though not formally, but the political key moment which started everything is the referendum for the UK to leave the European Union on the 23rd of June 2016, when 52 versus 48 leave won. And from that moment onward, British politics changed because Brexit became the issue of politics and public debate. Little else, really. So, the first consequence of the referendum was that the then Prime Minister, David Cameron, stepped down, and the new Prime Minister, Theresa May, was chosen. Not through new elections, because, as you know, in a parliamentary democracy, you do not need to have new elections, but you need your party to support you. So she was chosen within the Conservative Party. So Theresa May became, on the 14th of July 2016, the new prime minister. Then, after a few months where the direction of travel wasn't very clear, from October onwards it became much clearer because Theresa May gave a strong speech in the Conservative Party conference. The speech became famous for description of the citizens of nowhere. But beside that, she really endorsed a strong, hard, if you like, version of Brexit. She triggered, the British government triggered Article 50 on the 29th of March 2017. So that's when the process, the formal one, the one defined by Article 50, started. And then we start counting the 2 years. Now, in those 2 years, there are a number of important intermediate points. For instance, Theresa May, not happy with the majority she had in Parliament, called a snap election in the spring of 2017. Now, that was a bad judgment call, if you like, because we know she had a tiny majority, she ended up without a majority, so clearly wasn't the smartest political move, but she called new elections, and so a new intake of MP happened in the early summer 2017. And then we have, after almost more than 1 year and a half from the start of the negotiations, last November there was a deal, sorry, that's a spelling mistake, there is a deal on the withdrawal agreement. So finally, the EU and the UK find an agreement. Theresa May and her counterparts in Brussels, Donald Tusk, Jean-Claude Juncker, they agree on the terms of the withdrawal agreement and the political declaration. Everyone is happy. End of the story? No, because Theresa May gets back to London, has to have that deal approved by Parliament, don't forget, by 2 houses, but one counts far more than the other. So mainly by the House of Commons, the House of Lords, yes, has to approve it, but you may pretty much discount it. In any case, the House of Commons voted against Theresa May deal on the 15th of January, yesterday. And so, from the 15th of January, she tried to persuade her MPs, her backbenchers, to back the deal, but up to now, she hasn't been successful. So, the story of Brexit hasn't ended yet. It's still there, and many options, I can tell you, unfortunately, if you live there and there is big uncertainty, are still there. But what we are certain of, because of the Article 50, is that on the 29th of March 2019, at 11 p.m. British time, the UK will leave the European Union. That's certain, unless something else happens. The 2 years period defined by the Article 50 is very clear, on that at least. So on that day, unless they do something else, and we'll see what they may be able to do, Brexit will happen. Right, so that's a very short story of Brexit, 2 years in a slide. So what may happen now? There are many scenarios. I've got a few ones here. So according to the first one, if any version, and by any version, I mean either what Theresa May had agreed in November with the European Union, so the deal that was already rejected, that for some reason is brought back to Parliament, and then backbenchers approve it, or maybe a similar deal with some further guarantees by the European Union that this backstop will end at some point, that the UK will be able to quit the backstop whenever they wish. Now, if there is the guarantee, some backbenchers may be able to vote for a revised version of the deal. So in this case, what will happen after the 29th of March 2019? Well, nothing. Rather, something very important, but there will be a so-called transition period where nothing will change. So, European citizens will be able to move into the UK and British citizens into continental Europe without any visa. So there won't be any change regarding freedom of movement. British goods can be exported to continental Europe and European goods into the UK without tariffs, because the UK will remain part of the custom union. There will be, as usual, free flow of capital, there will be passporting for services, and so on and so forth. Well, to cut a long story short, everything will remain exactly as it is now, up to the 31st of December 2020. In the meanwhile, that's the plan, the UK and the EU will negotiate a trade deal, and then from the 1st of January 2021, the UK and the EU will trade, their relationship will be regulated by this new treaty. But there will be time, because in 1 year and a half, the expectation is that they will be able to agree on a new treaty. Now, the transition period may also be extended in case. But this is a big if any version is approved. What if there is no approval? Well, if there is no deal, the default option, so what's currently on the table, is hard Brexit. So, because there is nothing, there is no replacement from what we currently have. Currently, we have a regulatory structure regulated by the treaties and by EU legislation. You move out, but you have nothing to replace it. So it's a big problem, of course, but it is what we have on the table. Needless to say, some hard Eurosceptics do like the option, saying that this will increase the freedom that they currently enjoy. Now, this is the default option, but there are other possibilities, even though the space is shrinking. The first possibility, if the deal is voted down and there is as yet no alternative, is to extend Article 50. Well, you extend it, you get more time. Problem though, the extension requires the agreement of the 27 member states of the EU. So you can't extend it unilaterally, you need to go to Brussels and ask for an extension. Other problem, there are European Parliament elections coming up in May. So you extend. What's going to happen to British MPs? Would they have MPs if they remain members? Would British people vote for the European Parliament elections if they remain members? Doesn't seem to be the case, but these are all legal scenarios which need to be discussed, because may well be argued, if you're a member, you need to have representation in the organization you are a member of. And so maybe you need to have elections, but let's leave that aside. Now, the UK, though, may also revoke Article 50, and that can be done unilaterally. So, rather than extending it, the Prime Minister may say, right, we're going to revoke it. We were joking. So, nothing has happened, sorry, we are back to the starting point. Now, can they do it? Yes. There has been a ruling of the European Court of Justice confirming that this revocation can be unilateral, but think about the political cost. Can any Prime Minister do it? It seems inconceivable, and indeed, I put it among the unlikely options. As it stands, I also believe the option of a second referendum is very unlikely. Why? Well, because of a second referendum, what does a referendum need in the UK to come into practice? It needs to be regulated by law. So you need an act of parliament. And this takes time. It takes, people say, about 6 months. When Brexit is going to happen? On the 29th of March. Which day is today? The 20th of February. So there is no possibility whatsoever at the moment. Now, a referendum may take place if there is an extension long enough, if there are new elections and the new government decides to extend Article 50, but without an extension, there is, very simply, not enough time to have legislation for a second referendum. And by the way, there is not even a majority in the House of Commons. So, I mean, even not just the legal conditions, but even the political conditions are not there. So you can well forget for them. I mean, it's a fascinating idea for some, but the practicalities for having it are not there. All right, so, and of course, I mean, you're very welcome to challenge my thesis if you believe it is possible. There are very strong campaigners there that still believe a referendum is possible. I doubt it, but if you think that referendum is possible, please do say so. Right, so these are some of the options. And as you can see here, there seem to be two. I mean, on that Theresa May is quite right, or maybe three. An approval of the deal, hard Brexit, or an extension of Article 50. I think these are the three things which are currently on the table. Now, as I've said, what I wanted to discuss today is how this thing, Brexit, impacts on the Westminster model, impacts on what I called in the first slide, the relationship between the government on the one side and the parliament on the other. Who's winning? Is the government taking back control, or is it parliament taking back control? Is Brexit really reinstating the sovereignty of parliament, as some campaigners from the Leave side said in the run-up to the referendum, or is it rather something empowering the government, number 10? This is what we will be exploring today. But first, let me tell you a few words on this thing, the Westminster model. Now, the Westminster model is an ideal type, if you like. And it is an ideal type, a description of how political system works linked to Britain. Here you see a number of quotes. The cabinet, so the government in this model, is dominant vis-à-vis parliament. So the Westminster model says something very, very clear. Indeed, the government is a sort of elected dictatorship. Now, for Leipart, who's the scholar who devised those models, the Westminster model is a model in which the cabinet dominates, and there is actually, comparatively, no other more dominant than the British cabinet, which is the quintessential model of domination of the government. And in terms of power between the chambers, he says, well, there are two chambers, the House of Commons and the House of Lords, but in practical terms, the real power is concentrated in the House of Commons. So, yes, there is a concept there, the sovereignty of Parliament. In theory, you may expect the Parliament to be the foremost institution, but in practice, it is the government. And indeed, British prime ministers have historically been very famous to be assertive, powerful. Think about Margaret Thatcher. She couldn't be stopped. She implemented a different economic model, and she couldn't be stopped. So, could anyone stop the government from doing what it wants in Brexit? Could Parliament do it? Well, that's it indeed, what we want to discuss later on. Now you see here, that's from Leipart again, the UK is here. Now what's on this graph? Here it is a dimension which basically says here you find the most consensual, proportional countries. Here you find the most majoritarian. Here you find the most unitary countries. Here you find the most federal countries. The UK is here, very majoritarian, very unitary, despite the evolution. Why? Well, because the real power there is concentrated in London. And indeed, the money is there, is in London. It's not elsewhere. And it's also one of the reasons, just to give you, to make an illustration, one of the reasons why Scotland sometimes, and not long ago, had a referendum asking for independence, because they want more fiscal autonomy, because they are constrained, they feel they are constrained by London, and their preferences on public spending are not overlapping with the ones of the British government, particularly, I shall say, a conservative government. Right, so the UK is there. The question may really be reframed as, is the UK moving in this direction or in this direction as a result of Brexit? We argue it may be moving in this direction, even more to the right, even more towards a system where the government is all-powerful. Now, I will skip this one, as it is slightly too technical. I'm just going to tell you some recent reassessments of the Westminster model, which have nothing to do with Brexit, okay? So these people have been looking at this model, not taking Brexit into account, but have asked a very similar question to the one I'm asking. Is the Westminster model still all right when we talk about Britain, or have things changed? Well, you see here what they say. During the coalition government, Matthews and Flinders argue the parliament got more power. Some other people argue the parliament has so-called preventative influence. So, I mean, when you look at the votes, the House of Commons doesn't have much influence. But then when you look at what happens behind the scene, persuasion, hidden power, the House of Commons count more. And some other people argue the House of Lords is not as useless as it is often described. Anyway, despite those dissenting voices, the Westminster model is still a fairly good way to describe the British system. What I do here, and what we do in a project indeed, is to look at Brexit and the way in which, it impacts on the Westminster system. Now, of course, the fact that there is a Westminster system has also an influence on Brexit, because the Prime Minister can negotiate unbound in Brussels, and this is really a byproduct of what the Westminster system is about. Now, given that Brexit is not yet there, we focus on a process, not an outcome. And what we have to pay attention to is to, well, many things happen in life, and many things happen in the world. We are focusing on a very specific one, Brexit, and we have to be careful not to impute everything to Brexit. Say, the other day, the Honda, there was a plant producing cars in Swindon, a small, well, not so small, town in England. And in this place, well, this factory is closing down, and the executive of Honda said, this has nothing to do with Brexit. Now, we don't know, but the argument there, the official one, was Brexit, even though, I mean, certainly there are big changes ahead, has nothing to do with the closure. So we don't have to make the mistake of imputing everything happening in Britain to Brexit. As researchers, we have to track down the changes and make sure that we find a sort of causal connection between events. All right. So what we argue is that Brexit has been used by the government, and the government is getting more power, is getting more important because of Brexit. Why? Well, there are a number of factors that facilitate the so-called executive power grab vis-à-vis Parliament. First, the fact that the government has more structural power. It is controlling the process. Who's negotiating in Brussels? Do you send MPs in Brussels? No. You send the government. The Prime Minister, first of all, and then a person who's been created by Brexit, who's the Brexit secretary, who's changed 3 times in the process, by the way. But, I mean, the Brexit secretary is the one doing the job for the Prime Minister when the Prime Minister is not directly involved in the process. So, it's the government. And how does the Parliament control the government? Well, certainly the government has to go before a committee, and there is some form of scrutiny, but at the same time, the government doesn't disclose all the information it has, and the Parliament has been quite vocal in asking the government, please, please do give us more information. We want to know. But then, what could Parliament do if the government is really hiding information or not making, say, a legal advice or maybe an impact report public? Well, very little. It can shout. but in practical terms, it can do very, very little. Second, there is some urgency to act quickly within time constraints. And it may not be a coincidence that we are today, on February the 20th, without Brexit being concluded. Because the more you get towards the end, the fewer choices you've got. There is a text out there, the one the Parliament rejected. You want to come up with something different? Go for it. Do a different text. Make a different proposal. Can you do it, Parliament? Well, hardly so, because you are not negotiating, first. Second, you will need to find an agreement across parties. It's very complicated. The government can do it. So if time is short and is running short, then it is the government who's got more resources to act. And then finally, staff and information. Parliament has employed a few, well, not so few, but relatively to the government, very few civil servants to manage Brexit. The government has set up big departments to manage Brexit. My students at King's College were asking me, British students particularly, whether they could find a job because of Brexit. They said, well, rightly so, we're British citizens. We won't be able to work for European institutions afterward, because of course, I mean, only you nationals can work there. What can we do? No one will care about you any longer. Well, actually, departments such as the Department for Exit in the European Union, the Department of International Trade, the Prime Minister's office, they have employed hundreds of people to help them. The Home Office, of course, they are employing, and they've already employed hundreds of people to manage the process. So compare the thousands being employed by the different departments with the few, with the tens employed by Parliament. There is a big imbalance there. And that makes the government also more powerful. Because, of course, when you have to, these are complex, you have to negotiate everything. You need people who are experts to understand what's out there. And if you don't have people, well, what can you do? Very little. So the government has more power also in that regard. More administrators, more support, and qualified support. Now, let's get into the meat of this talk. And let's try to assess the impact of Brexit on government-parliament relations. Now, what we have here is the first Brexit secretary, David Davis. After him, there have been two others, who said the following at the start of the process. The principal objective of leaving the EU is for Parliament to take back control of UK laws and policies. A very clear, principled statement. The key objective of Brexit is for Parliament to regain, if you like, its sovereignty, which is the quintessential constitutional principle of British law. Now, that's a statement, though. Does it stand the test of reality? As political and social scientists, that's what we do. We don't trust lawyers. We don't trust a formal reading of institution. We want to check it empirically. Is this really the case? Now, when a minister says so, you can be skeptical to start with. Normally, a minister wants more power for himself, and it may be some lip service to Parliament rather than something else. But let's see empirically. Now, let me just say that there are two types of influence. One is about the process. So, has Parliament been able to control the process of Brexit? Has it got information from the government? Has it given a mandate to the government when going to Brussels? And so on and so forth. The other one, instead, is on the outcome of Brexit. Are the preferences of Parliament what parliaments want about Brexit, which is soft Brexit, by the way. I mean, there is a majority for soft Brexit. So for soft Brexit within the ranks of both parties taken together. Are those preferences taken into account, or are the harder preferences of the government having their way through the process? So these are two different types of influence you can look at. And there are a number of conditions which constrain influence, or rather make Parliament more influential, which we will explore empirically. What I'm going through are a number of key events which happen from the referendum, really, up to yesterday. So it's a number of key events in the Brexit process. Let's start with the first one. You did say before, the formal start of the process is when Article 50 is triggered. So, as easy as that? Well, not really. Because who triggers Article 50? Is it the government? Is it the government mandated by the Parliament? Who can say, let's start the Brexit process? For the government, for Theresa May, it was very clear, it's me. I can just send a letter, or rather send my ambassador to Brussels with a letter, and that's when we start the process of disentangling from the EU. Parliament didn't agree. So Parliament said, look, we want to be involved. We need, procedurally, to give you a mandate, to go to Brussels and do it. We may also tell you not to do it. You know, the referendum there has a legal value. So it's a sort of political act. The British people have spoken, but then it is Parliament who needs to transform those public preferences, if you like, into law, to put them into practice. Now, there was then, from the very beginning, this struggle between government on the one side and Parliament on the other. So what happened? Well, there was a case brought before the High Court and then the Supreme Court, and both the High Court and the Supreme Court told the government, which was one of the two recurrents, that the government had to have the authorization of Parliament to trigger Article 50. So, Parliament was very happy. We need to tell the government what it can do, can't act by itself. So, procedurally, it was a big victory. What has the government done? Well, the government has tabled a 133-word bill, 133, something like we are triggering Article 50 on the day. It has brought this bill before Parliament, and Parliament has voted on this bill. End of the story. So, yes, clearly a big procedural victory, but much ado about nothing, if you like, because at the end of the day, the government, with some fuss and some negotiation with Parliament, but nonetheless was very quick and able to pass through this bill, which was fast-tracked, and everything was very quick. On the 26th of January, the bill was introduced. On the 13th of March, there was the final reading in Parliament. So in little more than a month, the whole process was over. And the government, on the 29th of March, was able to go to Brussels and start the Brexit process. So that's the first case in which clearly the Parliament was involved, yes, but then the government had the upper hand. Second, on the EU withdrawal bill, which is the big bill, it was called once the Great Repeal Bill, because it is the one which has the scope of repealing all existing EU legislation which applies to the UK. Now, this is it's a 40 years of integration, repealed with a law. So it is something massive, really major. So it requires many so-called statutory instruments, which are regulations by the government to implement those changes in legislation which are needed once the UK is out of the EU. There has been one approved the other day on the UI, for instance, the university which is on the hill facing this one. It was not legislation, it was a statutory instrument. The government said the UK is out of the UI. And so, the process through which students are sent to the UI, etc., is over for the time being. Statutory instruments, regulations, are made by the government. Only by the government. Yes, there is a scrutiny committee in the Parliament, but the government is responsible to make them. Now, Parliament wasn't very happy because this law was telling the following to Parliament. Ministers, by regulation, make such provisions as the minister considers appropriate. Now, there doesn't seem to be a strong limit to the power of the executive. Whatever the government wants, the government can do it. And so, a big number of conservative backbenchers were against this carte blanche given to the government. And indeed, the media weren't very happy, the pro-Brexit media. You see here, these are MPs from the government, from the conservative benches supporting the government. They are called the Brexit mutineers. And other front pages had a similar tone. You see the pictures, the Brexit mutineers. They are the ones that want to derail Brexit. Anyway, at the end of the day, the government was reassuring, postponed the key decisions, and this bill was not really amended. So the government has kept a quite strong power in terms of its so-called statutory instruments. And there is a final vote here, which is the so-called meaningful vote on Theresa May deal, the one that failed the other day. And the government was very clear at first. On this vote, there should be no role for Parliament. So the Parliament should not be involved, it's us deciding. They can vote on a motion, something not binding, but we carry the responsibility for it. Parliament wasn't happy, they wanted to be involved. And so even here, they managed to be involved, but the government was able to keep the no-deal scenario as the default option. Parliament tried to bind some backbenchers, tried to bind the government. If your deal is voted down, no deal is not an option. We'll find something else, or we will automatically trigger extend Article 50. That didn't happen. The government was able to defeat all the amendments which were about taking out the no-deal scenario, which of course makes very happy the hard Brexiteers, which are not scared by a no-deal scenario because it will break away from you in the hardest possible way. Now, let me say a few words on, so these are three big moments in which Parliament tried hard, they got involved, but they didn't really change the substance on what was on the table. Now, why? First of all, let me tell you, contrary to what you may perceive by reading the press, for instance, up to December 2018, so in the first 1 year and 8 months of the process, the factions, that is, people within the Conservative Party voting against the government, despite all the protests, all the criticism, were very, very limited. So, at most, you had 12 rebels in the Conservative Party. Only 12 MPs voting against the government. You compare it with the Maastricht Treaty, which was the other treaty where big rebellions were present, well, this number is much bigger, but even on the Treaty of Lisbon, which was not very salient, to be honest, well, there were more rebellions. I shall say, this is up to December 2018. So it is the big legislation, it is not the vote on the deal itself, but you can see, very few rebels. So the government was able to keep the party united on the floor, despite all the protests, despite everything the media was saying, the Conservative Party, when voting, was cohesive, which meant, in a system where votes are tightly controlled by the government, that the government was able to control its party in Parliament, up to December 2018. Interestingly, the Labour Party had many more problems. So the opposition and the party, which in theory you may say is supporting soft Brexit or even Remain, share certainly for Remain, the voters of the Labour Party are overwhelmingly for Remain, particularly in the cities, well, you see here, 90 rebels in the Labour Party. So, despite all the comments about the weakness of the Prime Minister and the difficulties faced by the Conservative Party, which are true, the opposition wasn't feeling any better. Actually, the opposition, the official opposition, was facing many more rebellions, 90, a number which is higher than Maastricht and, of course, Lisbon. So the Labour Party has really been into troubles, and that explains also why Jeremy Corbyn has been very hesitant to take a line on Brexit. Now, on the Lords, I don't want to really say much because it's a minor point, but the Lords haven't been stopping the government. Now, to be fair with the Lords have been amending and opposing each single bill on Brexit. So each single bill has been heavily amended by the Lords. But how does it work? Well, it works playing ping pong. So it is here in the Commons, goes back to the Lords amend it, gets back to the Commons, then the Commons vote down all the amendments of the Lords. They wipe them out. What do the Lords do? Nothing. They say, okay guys, we were joking, we won't continue opposing you. Well, why? Because the Lords are unelected. And so by convention, the Lords won't stand against the other chamber if the political conditions are not there. So they won't play an institutional game for the sake of it. So after a first, if you like, symbolic opposition, their amendments were wiped out, and then we were back to the usual game between the government and the chamber. So you can well discount the Lords in this process. Now, this is the result when Theresa May deal agreed after almost 2 years of negotiations with the European Union in November 2018 was voted on the floor of the House of Commons. What happened? Well, you see it here. It was defeated by an incredible margin, 230 votes. You see here, there were 118 conservative rebels. So Theresa May finally lost control of the party. And here, the Labour Party instead was able to stay united against the deal with only 3 defections. Hard Brexiteers, left-wingers of the Labour Party. Now, the government knew it was going to lose this vote. Indeed, this vote was originally scheduled to be held in December. Then the government postponed it in the hope of convincing the backbenchers to support it. Now, in January, it had to be voted. You see here, it was a massive defeat. The defeat with the highest margin in the history of contemporary politics in Britain. But the government is still in place. And this is quite amazing, because we have the biggest defeat in the parliamentary history of Britain, and then you have a government that on the flagship piece of legislation, they had agreed with Brussels, is still there. And apparently no change has happened. Why? Again, because Parliament doesn't have an alternative. So Theresa May is still there, stubborn, still, but she fights and she says, I lost. I understand it, but that's the only game in town. Unless you have an alternative, I'm going to be back with this deal. And indeed, what she's now doing is to find, some tweaks, some fine-tuning, some amendment, some reassurances, so that when this deal is back to Parliament, well, these guys won't be there, will be here. And these guys, which are the DUP, which are supporting the Northern Irish MPs, supporting the government with a confidence supply deal, well, they won't be here, they will be here. And so, by maybe a tiny margin, the deal will get through. That's what Theresa May bets on, don't forget, urgency. On the 29th of March, the alternative may be hard deal. So some of those guys here may say, well, what do we go for? We go for no deal Brexit, hard Brexit, or we accept a deal that at least for 16 months keep us in practice in the European Union. So the chances are that this deal, at the end of the day, and despite this historic defeat, will go through. So who's the winner at the end of the day? The winner is the government. Let me be a bit outspoken, a bit simplistic in this judgment. Why? Well, because the government has been smart, first of all. They've been fencing off rebellions by postponing key confrontations until the very end. And often at the very end, there was no alternative. And so the government got what it originally planned, maybe with some tweaks, with some minor refinements, but the substance was all there. So Parliament wasn't a loser altogether. They were involved more than the government desired. They were involved. But it is a sort of institutional game. They get involved, but once they're involved, they seem to be happy as such. They don't fight any longer. Our role is recognized. Thank you very much. Now it's your turn. So that's how the game is mainly played. So the government has two things on its side. Well, it's time, of course, which is very important. And second, it can count on the absence of a cross-party majority in Parliament for an alternative. And this is really, the confrontational style of the Westminster system has really impeded the parties who, as I said before, have a majority of members for soft Brexit to come together. And the government has been exploiting these differences. While the government is certainly weak compared to other British governments, Parliament has been unable to take control. To get back to David Davis' quote at the very beginning of this class, well, certainly Brexit hasn't given sovereignty back to Parliament, if not in a fully formal and not substantive sense. By the way, as of today, we are 37 days to Brexit. And so this may be another advantage for the government. Now, let me finish off with a postscriptum. This is the last slide. And indeed here you see a few people. I mean, the 5 guys over there, I mean, there should be 2 others who have been cut. I mean, you see half of one of them, so it's 5.5. There should be 7. I mean, these 7 guys split from the Labour Party yesterday, so they are all Remainers. They are very disappointed with the way in which Jeremy Corbyn managed the Brexit process. There is also another issue, anti-Semitism, which is very important, but let's leave it aside. They split from the Labour Party, they created this new centrist group, and these 3 guys here, these 3 ladies here, actually, split today from the Conservative Party and joined the former enemies on the other side, on the opposing benches, to form an independent group. What's coming up there, we don't know, but it's a significant change, because you have not just opposition in votes or abstentions, but you have a split off. So there is a new party, parliamentary party for the time being, created. And then there you see instead Rees-Mogg, the figurehead of the hard Brexiteers. At the moment they are sort of winning the game, because, well, they've been dictating the agenda. They're a big organized group, so every time Theresa May moved too much towards the center, they were very keen to meet immediately. They got their whip, they got their funding, they're very organized, and tell her, look, Theresa, you're moving too much towards the center. If you carry on, you lost us. And they are 70, 60, 50. But if you have a minority government, they've got an extraordinary power. And indeed, they do not dislike hard Brexit. So, to conclude, who won? The government. But what's happening on Brexit? God knows.
All right.
So, if there is any question or comment, I'm more than happy to take it, of course, or any curiosity. There is anything which is puzzling about this Brexit or incomprehensible about this process, I can try to clarify if I know it. I mean, I'm the first not to know all the intricacies of this process. But feel free to ask really whatever or to comment.
A lot of what you talked about was around this deal. What were some of the like parameters around the deal, and what were some of the reasons why it didn't get passed?
There was massive dissatisfaction with this deal. If you have such numbers in Parliament, when you've been preparing the vote for more than one month, well, clearly something has got very wrong on the government side. Now, this deal disappointed everyone for different reasons. For most of those 118 members of the Conservative Party against the deal belong to that European research group of hard Brexiteers. What they didn't want to have was the backstop, what I mentioned at the beginning, the safety net which, in case the UK and the EU do not agree on a trade agreement after Brexit Day, makes a hard border between Northern Ireland and the island of Ireland impossible. Now, what do they dislike about the backstop? The fact that according to this backstop, this plan, Northern Ireland, to avoid the hard border, will remain in a sort of custom union with the EU, and will remain in the single market with the EU. So de facto, Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK, Wales, Scotland and England, will follow different regulatory regimes. And this is unacceptable because it will split the UK, or it will be a first step towards a separation of Northern Ireland from the rest of the UK, according to these people. They also claim that once you have a differentiated regime which applies to one of the regions or the nations making up the UK, well, others may follow. What about Scotland? So the Scottish Prime Minister has been very outspoken on the matter. She said, Nicola Sturgeon, she said, look, if Northern Ireland is given the possibility to remain in the common, in the custom union, in the common market, Scotland would like to do the same. Otherwise, there is an unfair competition between Northern Ireland and Scotland. We are part of the same nation. It shouldn't be the case. So, you know, there is a point, indeed, in the backstop which is problematic, but if the red line, if you are starting by saying what's not negotiable is that there shouldn't be any hard border in Ireland, well, then you have to find a solution. And the alternatives haven't worked. Boris Johnson said at some point that there can be technological systems being able to control who's crossing the border without stopping these people. So no hard checks at the border, but technology. He said it's like driving your car between two boroughs in London. There is a camera taking, the number, and that's what you need, nothing else. But this is seen as unfeasible. So the backstop was really the main reason behind the rebellion within the Conservative Party. It is notable the sum of those people who voted for are actually members of the Conservative Party. I mean, many of the Brexit mutineers in the previous slide, you remember, this slide in which I've shown you these guys who voted against the government. These are pro-Remain. Many of them voted, I'm simplifying when I say pro-Remain, but to give you the general picture. Many of them voted for Theresa May deal. Why? Well, because they were fearful the alternative is the hard Brexit. So they say, well, this deal is not excellent, but it's better than hard Brexit. So they decided to support it. As for the DUP voted against this deal exactly for the same reasons the hard Brexiteers. For the DUP, the Unionist Party of Northern Ireland, it's completely unacceptable, of course, to separate Northern Ireland from the rest of the UK. That's their raison d'etre. And that's the biggest contingency of this process. Ireland is so significant at the very moment in which the DUP, a Northern Irish party, is key for the survival of the government. So it's a combination of factors that make the issue of Ireland really, really explosive.
You mentioned, well, you included a quote from David Davis saying the principal objective of leaving the EU was for Parliament to take back control of UK policies. What were some of the policies that they felt they had no control over, and what is the EU's part in making them feel this way? Also, have any countries been encouraged to leave the EU or talked about this, or discouraged?
Well, thanks. Indeed, it is something which may seem simple. It's not that simple. There have been many estimates on the contribution of EU legislation on British law. So how many laws are nowadays made by Brussels rather than by the British Parliament, by the House of Commons, given that, I mean, the House of Commons, in any case, has to take legislation from Brussels, but of course it doesn't have the power to amend it, so takes it as it is from Brussels. Now, that depends on the policy area. I mean, take environment. Environment is an area where legislation is overwhelmingly made in Brussels, no longer in London, no longer in Rome, no longer in Paris. Take agriculture. That's another area where laws are made in Brussels and not in London or wherever. But perhaps when David Davis is saying something of this sort, he's not really talking, or thinking rather, about environment or agriculture, which are not very salient politically. You don't normally win elections on agriculture or on protecting badges. That's not what happens. You win elections on migration nowadays. And certainly if there is an area where British people wanted to take back some control, we can discuss how much, but certainly some control, according to all polls, this is migration. Now, the UK is not part of Schengen, but it has to accept, being a member of the EU, freedom of movement, which means that there is arguably no control of who comes into the UK from the European Union. And we know after the enlargement of Central and Eastern Europe, particularly from the new 8 states of Europe, thousands of people moved to the UK. And that was unmanaged, poorly managed at least, and certainly had big electoral consequences. Now, taking back control of migration is indeed something which is going to happen with Brexit. So, I mean, we can't certainly say that David Davis in that regard is lying, because the UK will need, and it has already been discussed at second reading, a new immigration bill, then act, once approved by Parliament, which will decide who gets, what conditions EU migrants, I'm no longer talking about EU citizens, EU migrants will need to have in order to move to the UK. Now, there is no legislation as yet, but just to give you an idea of what the government has been thinking of, is to put a salary threshold. So if you earn less than £30,000 per year, you won't be able to move there. They are thinking about 2 different types of visas. One for the highly skilled jobs. Those people may stay there for up to 5 years, but then after 5 years they can apply for British permanent residency first and then citizenship. Low-skilled workers will only have 2 years, and then they will be forced to leave the country. So, I mean, this is a big change, of course. I mean, if you go to London, I'm sure you've been, and you go and you want to drink a coffee, you'll notice that all baristas are from, there are no British people working there. Mainly are from Eastern Europe, there are many Italians, many Southern Europeans. So these people, with the new regime, which is being taught now won't be able to move there, if not for a short period, and they will need to move back to their country or another place of Europe. Okay, so this is a clear example where you can say that the government is delivering what they promise. They are taking back control of migration. Now, a critic may tell you, yes, but nowadays the number of people from outside the EU getting into Britain are twice the number of EU citizens. So what the government can already control, it seems to be unable to control because migrants from there are flowing to Britain in big numbers. And actually, with the decline of EU migrants, there has been a surge in extra EU migrants. So on the numbers, there is some confrontation. But still, formally speaking, surely the British government will need to have an immigration act regulating migration once free movement ends. No doubt about it. Thanks, it's a very good question.
What do citizens think about all that? Because in the end, they have a more unresponsive government, at least unresponsive to parliament. They have no certainty about what is going to happen in 37 days. Their parties have split. So what is the state of public opinion with respect to all that? Thanks.
So it's an excellent question, of course, and it's a very relevant point which I haven't covered in the presentation. Now, according to the latest polls, not just the very latest, I mean, this has been something consolidating quite strongly in all the latest polls, is that British citizens, really across the board, think that the process has been very poorly managed by the government. So there is a clear, I mean, I'm saying roughly, I mean, I'm making up the data now, but roughly 2/3 of all the respondents, and again, I mean, with tiny variations across party, think the Brexit process has been poorly managed by the government and distinctively by the British Prime Minister. So there is quite a strong consensus on that. But this element is coupled with something else which makes their combination very curious. The Labour government, the Labour would-be government, is not perceived to be a really feasible alternative. The Conservative, despite a vast majority of people saying that the measure of Brexit, that is their flagship policy, has been very poor, maybe catastrophic, they are not moving on to support the Labour Party. So Jeremy Corbyn is still seen as a much less credible leader than Theresa May, despite everything that Theresa May has done or not done. So even in the polls, if you like, the situation is in a sort of conundrum, is blocked, because you do have a government which has lost much of the trust of the people. At the same time, the opposition is in a better shape. So there is no way out, in a way. Now, as to the big question, Remain, Brexit, there has been a marginal swing towards Remain, but that wasn't big enough, some people like John Curtis would argue, to trigger a move of the parties. Yes, Remain has become marginally stronger, but at the same time, supporting Remain still is a big risk given that there was a first referendum, etc., etc. So no big move in public opinion, no big move in party politics.
All right, so if you want to go to London, please do so before 29th of March. That minimizes your risk, then you'll be able to do it, but nonetheless, also if you want to move money across the UK, or do it before the 29th of March. If you want to move your pension, sorry, that's my problem, that's another story. Okay, I won't speak about it.
Great.